Wouldn't it be nice if this episode just focused on feel-good stories, where I tell you that you are perfect just the way you are, and that you shouldn't change a thing, you adorable thing, you? Yeah, good luck with that. Instead, let's get busy and do some real work. Welcome to episode 19 of All Roads Lead to Rome. I'm Dr. Bickford, and in the last episode, we explored Catholic virtue ethics and painted a pretty broad picture of how they developed and what their goal is. Remember, the goal isn't just to be obedient to arbitrary rules. The goal is to develop a truly holy life so we can experience beatitude, which is total happiness and communion with God. Today, we get very specific and look at the 4 cardinal virtues and then the 3 theological virtues. However, there is one more virtue that is so special that it is seldom discussed. It is the virtue of subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review if you use a podcast player that allows them, like Spotify with its ratings and Apple with its full reviews. And please be sure to tell your Catholic curious friends whether they think they need this podcast or not. Thank you. If you want to understand why Catholics practice virtue ethics and how the goal is to develop a holy life, please start with the last episode, number 18. In this episode, we will focus on the 2 main categories for virtue ethics. The cardinal virtues are the ones that started with Socrates and got further developed by Aristotle. They are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. We develop these virtues by performing good acts consistently so that they become habits. The other category is the theological virtues. We see these get developed by St. Augustine, and they are faith, hope, and charity, which he developed from 1 Corinthians 13. These are the virtues that God pours into our lives and gives us the grace to carry out. It would be easy to assume that we are to follow one path or the other, because they're 2 very different things. But, like in a number of other areas of Catholic theology, the answer is not either or, but both and. The genius of this is that it allows for God's grace to work as God chooses in the dispensing of the theological virtues, and it allows for human free will in choosing to develop the cardinal virtues. We can commit to working towards holiness in our efforts by developing the cardinal virtues, but it is purely the work of God to fill us with the grace of the theological virtues. You follow? Now, let's unpack them and see how they work. And let's start with the cardinal virtues. Remember, the word cardinal means hinge. These virtues are like the hinges of a door that everything else swings on. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude are the human virtues that guide ethical behavior. I will define them using the work of Joseph Pieper. He was a German Catholic philosopher who lived from 1904 to 1997. And one of his great books was the book, The 4 Cardinal Virtues, which is a surprisingly easy title to remember. What makes Pieper important is that he helped lead a resurgence of using the thinking of Aquinas in the mid-20th century. That movement has only gained momentum as we now work our way through the 21st century. And so for Pieper, prudence is the mold and the mother of all the other virtues. He argues that prudence is the ability to perceive reality truthfully and to act accordingly. By seeing the world as it truly is, the prudent person can fully align their judgment with the truth of reality. To possess prudence, you need good memory, docility, and quick-wittedness. You need to be able to assess the situation without superimposing your beliefs, ideology, or preferences upon them. And for Pieper, when you do not have prudence, the other cardinal virtues break down. Courage becomes reckless, temperance becomes rigid, and justice becomes legalism. Or, as he puts it on page 3 of my version of the book, quote, "Only the prudent man can be just, brave, and temperate, and the good man is good insofar as he is prudent," end quote. Okay, so what are some examples of prudence in the real world? Well, creating a personal budget and saving money for the future rather than spending impulsively. Taking safety seriously, like wearing seatbelts when driving, or looking both ways when crossing a street. Drivers where I live are so bad that I actually look both ways before I turn down a one-way street. We show prudence in our professional decision-making, like putting your customers first and prioritizing quality and reputation over profit. When it comes to communication with others, prudent people think before speaking, especially on sensitive topics. The next virtue is justice, and it is the virtue of giving each person their due. This is about so much more than what is legally correct. It is about the moral structure of interpersonal relationships. It's rooted in complete respect for the other and knowing that each human being has dignity and not just legal rights. It requires total honesty, gratitude, and consistent fairness. I was once part of a large organization that had some people working in it as if it were a meritocracy, and others working in it as if it was an old boys network. Over time, I watched the old boys come to dominate, and many of the meritocracy type folks left. If progress was based on who you knew or what clique you belonged to, people who wanted to work hard saw that it became an act of futility to do so. Justice can never work in an old boys network. And in giving each person their due, justice governs relationships and ensures fairness and respect. Of the four cardinal virtues, justice is the most relational because it's lived in the context of all kinds of relationships, from juridical ones to deeply personal ones. Real-world examples of justice would include standing up for others, especially when they cannot stand up for themselves. I attended a Jesuit high school that was far enough away that I had to take the subway system of the city I lived near. And I remember an incident in my first year, 14 years old, having no idea what I was doing, standing on a train platform with my distinctive school's bag, waiting, and someone started to throw insults my way. I'd never had that happen before, and I froze. And while I was watching the person, two large upperclassmen from my school were nearby. They came over, dropped their bags next to mine, and just kept talking to each other. No threat, no returned insults. And they didn't even acknowledge the person talking to me. But they sent the message that there were three of us, not one. They had no need to do anything, but chose to do it in a way that brought the best possible outcome, which was that no confrontation took place. I learned a great lesson that day, and it's one I've always tried to apply. The next virtue is temperance. This is the virtue of selfless integration. This is where we see reason dominate and shape the desires of the will. As justice is the most social of the cardinal virtues, temperance is the most private. It shows an appropriate self-control over one's actions and one's priorities. For Pieper, the virtues don't just stand on their own as a random list. They are deeply integrated with each other. Real-world examples of temperance include resisting gluttony when it comes to eating or drinking. In today's world, managing the use of technology is a big act of temperance. So many people have become addicted to their phones and just sit at home all night doom scrolling. Self-regulating your screen time is a very big challenge today and is an act of temperance. And then finally, controlling emotions and avoiding emotional reactivity has always been seen as an important display of temperance. And then the fourth cardinal virtue is fortitude. It is the virtue of being courageous in the face of danger and suffering. Fortitude is also endurance in the face of injustice. It's a willingness to suffer for the sake of the good. We see tremendous fortitude in the saints and martyrs of the church. They know what is just and will endure anything, including martyrdom, for the sake of the faith. This willingness to endure suffering is not a weakness. It's actually a display of courage and gives the most appropriate response to whatever a situation calls for. Now, fortitude doesn't look for danger or for opportunities to suffer, but it is not afraid of them. Those who possess fortitude also show a tremendous vulnerability because they must have something to lose. Without this vulnerability, nothing is at stake, and therefore there's no need for real courage. Real-world examples of fortitude include speaking the truth in a situation where the truth may cost you your job or your reputation. Helping others at the risk of your own safety is another example. Historically, whenever a deadly plague broke out somewhere, as everyone would flee the sick and dying, priests and nuns would always rush in and care for them, even if it cost them their own lives. Another real-world example is when you honor commitments, even when they become hard or you don't want to. If your word is your bond, then it is something that has been forged in fortitude. So these are the 4 cardinal virtues. And again, for Pieper, prudence is the mother of the virtues and guides the others. Justice gives the virtues direction in how they should move. Fortitude sustains them, and temperance preserves their integrity. One of the best summaries I've ever heard of this was in a talk by Bishop Robert Barron. And he described it this way: prudence is the moral law that shows the course of action God calls us to. Through it, we seek to live a life of justice, which defines how we engage in the world and treat others. But there are 2 sources of problems. There are the internal threats, like our own pride, our jealousy, our anger, and so on. So to combat those, we develop temperance. Those are the internal threats. But there are also external threats, like what happens when people treat us poorly or persecute us or behave unjustly toward us. To combat those, we develop fortitude. A very simple explanation, but I spent weeks chewing on it after I heard it. In fact, you may want to rewind this a bit and write them down. This is really worth spending time wrestling with. And again, what is so important to remember is that we have a lot of control over whether we develop these virtues and how far we develop them. They're called the natural virtues. Now we turn our attention to the supernatural virtues, better known as the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And again, these are the virtues that are infused by God and orient the soul towards Him. These are not ones we work at and cultivate by habit and so on. Faith is a belief in God and how He has revealed Himself through Scripture. Faith is the foundation of the Christian life, and God's revelation is the lens through which we view life, the world, and eternity. Hope is trust in God's promise of eternal life. It is trust in how God can work good from suffering. It is trust in the promise that life conquers death, that love conquers hate, and that Jesus is the path to God. Charity is a bit complicated because for us today, the word has a very specific meaning, and it means being generous to those who need it. But the word charity actually means so much more. It's the greatest of the virtues. It starts with loving God more than anything else in life and loving others. Charity perfects the other virtues and is the essence of Christian morality. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul describes how each of us is different and each of us has different spiritual gifts from God. He also explains that it is all by design to fulfill God's plan. We each make a unique contribution to the plan based on the gifts that God has given us. And then Paul continues into the next chapter, chapter 13, where he offers a caveat that says, you know what? As good as our gifts are, none of them matter. And our calling in life doesn't matter if we do not have love. chapter 13 is a very important addition to chapter 12. But at most of the weddings I've been to over the years, chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians is one of the scripture readings that's most often read. And it leaves you thinking that it's a standalone, and it's really just a reflection on love. But think about it in terms of how important it is to have love in the use of our gifts. And here's chapter 13. Quote, "If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For now, we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly. But then, in the time to come, we will see face to face. Now, I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now, faith, hope, and charity abide, these three. And the greatest of these is charity." End quote. Have you heard that at a wedding? Yeah, you probably have. So, how do we manifest these theological virtues? Faith is manifested in trusting God and His revealed truth. We do not let personal, professional, or even medical crises shake our faith. The saints are not spared the suffering of this life. Instead, they overcome it through their unwavering faith in God. And that's what we need to do. The saints have also deep and consistent prayer lives. If your faith is strong, you always seek to spend more time with God. Hope is manifested in the trust of God's promise of eternal life. We contextualize the good and bad of this life in comparison to eternity. Spiritual well-being always takes precedence over material well-being, especially during the hard times. People with hope are people who can easily forgive and do not hold grudges. And then there is charity, often treated as just a synonym for love, but it's deeper than that. It's truly fulfilling the call of Jesus in Matthew 22, where He said, quote, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." End quote. People filled with the virtue of charity engage in acts of mercy to serve others. They continually give of themselves to help others with any need they have. They show compassion. They forgive freely, and they put others first. It's not just a feeling of love, but a love that is put into action for others. And of course, this all sounds wonderful, but I can tell you it comes at a price. If you live a life of charity, you will be used, abused, taken for granted, and betrayed. So, if you give charity to others, it can be very painful. But if you do charity as a service to God, it will be virtuous. So, once again, the cardinal virtues are the ones that we develop through the building of habits that contribute to the virtuous life. The theological virtues are infused into our lives by God. Together, they lead us on the true path to holiness of life, which is really our only true goal while on earth. And what makes this all so profound is that our reason, which is our intellectual capacity, our will, which is our desires and passions, and God's grace can all work together in harmony. Most of us lead lives that are disconnected and discombobulated, but they can be harmonious. But it's not easy. I mean, the fact that there are not so many saints should show that this is a challenging and significant undertaking. But remember, it's the only real goal we have in life. Everything else fades away and cannot be taken with us after we die. And because it is a focus on the development of a holy life, you can imagine how a secular, materialistic, and consumerist culture will react to it. Each of the major virtues described here has a negative connotation in today's pop culture as a way to diminish its effectiveness. Think about prudence and think about the stereotype of an old prude. What kind of person is that? A prude is someone who never has fun. They're easily shocked and offended. They complain about others having fun, and they're seen as narrow-minded. Well, what about justice? Isn't the phrase, rules are made to be broken, a common mantra today? Aren't people today more interested in their rights than in what is right? Temperance, at least in American culture, is often associated with the temperance movement in the 19-teens and 1920s during the era of Prohibition, where alcohol consumption was outlawed in the country. These people were seen as being anti-alcohol, anti-sex, anti-pleasure, and pretty much anti-everything. And then people with fortitude are seen as stubborn, inflexible, and people who suffer needlessly. This is how our culture views the cardinal virtues. And what does our culture replace them with? Well, in our culture, a fulfilling life is pretty straightforward. It comes from being rich, young, sexy, and famous. You just need those four things. And people marvel at celebrities and fawn over everything they do because that is seen as the goal in life. So, in our efforts to seek holiness, we not only have to fight the devil and our own desires, but the culture is working against us as well. One of the oldest Christian letters known is the letter or epistle to Diogenes. I knew I was going to say that wrong. Diogenes. I practiced this 10 times, and of course I say it wrong when I'm recording. Diogenes. It was written around the year 130 to explain Christianity to someone who knew very little about it, someone named Diogenes. In the most famous part of the letter, he describes Christians and how they're different from others. This is 3 paragraphs. Stay with me on this. Quote, Christians are indistinguishable from other men, either by nationality, language, or customs. They do not inhabit separate cities of their own, or speak a strange dialect, or follow some outlandish ways of life. Their teaching is not based upon reveries inspired by the curiosity of men. Unlike some other people, they champion no purely human doctrine. With regard to dress, food, and manner of life in general, they follow the customs of whatever city they happen to be living in, whether it is Greek or foreign. And yet, there is something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full role as citizens, but labor under the disabilities of being foreigners. Any country can be their homeland, but for them, their homeland, wherever it may be, is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose them. Exposing children meant the way they would kill babies. It was their form of abortion. They share their meals, but not their wives, meaning they don't engage in orgies. They live in the flesh, but they are not governed by the desires of the flesh. They pass their days upon earth, but they are citizens of heaven. Obedient to the laws, yet they live on a level that transcends the law. Christians love all men, but all men persecute them. Condemned because they are not understood, they are put to death, but raised to life again. They live in poverty, but enrich many. They're totally destitute, but possess an abundance of everything. They suffer dishonor, but that is their glory. They are defamed, but vindicated. A blessing is their answer to abuse. Deference, their response to insult. For the good they do, they receive the punishment of malefactors. But even then, they rejoice as though receiving the gift of life. They are attacked by the Jews as aliens. They are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet no one can explain the reason for this hatred. End quote. That was life in the Roman Empire. As our culture becomes more secular today and more anti-Christian today, we're going to see more and more of these traits at work. The world hates virtue ethics, and both the cultivation of holiness and the moral accountability that goes with it. And all of this makes the effort at holiness a very complicated undertaking. That's why it's important for us to remember that it all exists for the single purpose of helping us become holy. If you want to study this more, I suggest you start with the Catechism. Paragraphs 1803 to 1845 focus on the virtues. I would then recommend talking to a priest. The Summa Theologia of St. Thomas Aquinas is really the most comprehensive source. The last episode focused, remember, on the first part of the second part of the Summa. And this episode really was focusing on the second part of the second part of the Summa. But it can get very, very technical. And as I said last week, this is a couple thousand pages of the Summa. It may be better to read commentaries on it rather than the Summa itself if you've had no formal training in philosophy or theology. But know that it is there. So, what will be on the test for today? The four cardinal, or hinge, virtues in life are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. These are the virtues that we can cultivate through the development of a habitual pattern of behavior. To this, we add the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which all come from God and His grace. And holiness of life is the reason why we exist on earth. And if you've never encountered virtue ethics before, then I hope you now see this is a profound example of just how true it is that all roads lead to Rome.